welcome back to another video. So today we are going to be finally starting this new sketchbook. I just want to preface this video though with saying that this sketchbook is actually a notebook. It does have plenty of blank pages on the inside, so I'm going to be treating it as a sketchbook basically. On the inside, actually, I don't know if you guys can see it very well just because my webcam has a hard time focusing on smaller objects, but on the inside it does say the date is April 27th, 2023. I'm actually recording this first page on April 29th, 2023. Also, I briefly showed you guys kind of like the planning and sketching, and the reason why the paper is kind of wrinkly and kind of really buckled is because I forgot to show it prior to filming and doing the front cover, or I guess like the inside cover for today's session, so therefore the paper was wrinkly. But I did do kind of like a little bit of thumbnailing and just like jotting down notes and my thoughts and stuff for the inside cover as kind of like preliminary sketches. And yeah, I just like to do that on the back side just because I don't really care too much on what goes on that side. I usually put stickers, some sketches of planning for usually the first spread. So let me explain this first. The sketch is done with the Pilot Color ENO as usual, and I did a cleaner sketch using the Pirsmacolor Col-Eraser in the color Carmine, and I like to use those two kind of to prep the surface for how I want to use watercolor and gouache, just because one is kind of more water soluble and then the other one isn't, so we can kind of let it remain as is. And I actually had a lot of fun just painting with watercolor doing this piece, so I kind of am a little bit sad that I covered it up with gouache, but I don't think I would have liked it if I just lined the sketch with just the watercolor wash and stuff on it. But I do prefer the colors with the watercolor as usual because it tends to be a little bit more, I don't know, a little bit lighter, more pastel, and a little bit softer in my opinion. I think it's just like a skill issue for me because I don't know how to use gouache too efficiently or proficiently, I guess, so I can achieve the same look. But you can kind of see like a running theme. I'm still sticking with kind of like either my OC or a Wanu spread, and then kind of doing mostly foliage for now because I do want to get better at layering up this kind of more dense type of foliage, and I'll explain that once we get into the gouache session. But let's talk about how I did kind of a bit of the planning and what I usually do for the inside covers for my sketchbooks anyways. So even though the front design does have like ginkgo leaves, it's more yellow and blue centered, I was kind of planning on going with a little bit more yellows, blues, and greens for this, but after the gouache session goes along, it becomes primarily green, which I'm not upset with. It just definitely doesn't fit with the front cover, which, you know, isn't a problem. I don't tend to make them look similar, but sometimes I want to take that into consideration just because the edges do expose kind of like the front cover. But the general idea is usually that I like doing a character, and I tend to do it in gouache. I've done it with watercolor and ink before. I've done it also with, I think, alcohol markers for the back spread in the past. But I like usually doing these with gouache because the color tends to be a little bit more punchy and I can get it to be a little bit more clean. But like I said, the purpose is kind of like the first page and the inside cover I treat as the first spread as like a welcome or a hello page. And then when I finish the sketchbook, the last page alongside with the inside cover, but these ones tend to have a pocket at the back, which I believe this one does. Yes, this one does, and I usually paint that to have something very similar to the front cover, something usually either reflecting it or a similar theme or just visually similar, so that we can have like a goodbye page, and that kind of concludes the whole sketchbook. So I'm gonna kind of give you my ideas of what I wanted the front and back to be matching to what it would look like potentially, and we'll see in a couple of months. I'm guessing it's either the 8 to 9 months route I'm gonna take, or I'm gonna take the 5 to 6 months. I usually do 5 to 6 months, but because the sketchbook does have a lot of pages, it might take me a little bit longer depending on how much I can keep up with a sketchbook habit this year. But like I said, let me explain. So I wanted Masaki to be laying down with the flowers, hence why his hair looks a little bit flared out, just a bit. I know some people think his hair looks like Oikawa from Haikyuu. I can see the resemblance at times, but Masaki's hair I feel like isn't as short or spiky compared to Oikawa, but I think here it looks a little bit more like him when I first did this sketch, but I think it looks more like Masaki a little bit later. But because he's laying down, his hair is kind of flared out, I'm gonna have a little bit of the clovers overlapping his shoulder as well as in his hair so that it kind of resembles a little bit more of him being embedded into the surface. I don't think I do too good of a job just because I was kind of having a hard time keeping the colors kind of clean with working with gouache. I definitely still struggle with the idea of either wanting to blend too much or keeping things very much more like cell shady-ish. So we kind of just go through back and forth because sometimes I go through phases of like I block it in, therefore I think I should go more cell shady, but the more layers I add, the more colors I add, it kind of gets a little bit more painterly, which I prefer. I just feel like I need to trust the process a little bit more or trust myself, I guess, maybe. Because gouache is still a medium that I wish to get better at. I definitely struggle with these kinds of mediums where it's very hard to control the consistency. You'll have to worry about color mixing as well, and then just like application or just accuracy. Sometimes I feel like I beat myself up a little bit whenever I accidentally paint over an area too much or I miss, because you know, sometimes working with a fat brush or like something that's not as accurate as like super thin mechanical pencil, just a brush like that, it's hard for me to get a certain consistency to get a thin line. So I don't know where exactly I'm putting the paint or like where I'm placing the brush, so sometimes it does become a little bit messy. But I definitely think like adding line work at the end kind of helps me regain a little bit of that confidence. So before we get too far into the painting process, so I usually do watercolor to kind of prep the page in terms of color wise, alongside with making a page have something, or having the gouache, no, letting the gouache have something to grip onto because of the watercolor and stuff. I just feel like sometimes when I add watercolor, it just doesn't really sit on the paper that well. It might be due to oils, it might be just because the surface is so glossy, it doesn't really seep through the page as nicely. But I feel like when I use gouache, sometimes when I do thinner layers, I do like the fact that the watercolor already primed the paper a little bit to have that bit of grittier texture. So it just helps me a little bit. And then when doing the gouache portion, I like to start off with the face, because for me it makes or breaks the piece, because I love drawing the face a lot. Also, ignore the hand. I know his hand is awkwardly proportioned and it doesn't make a lot of sense. So yeah, just ignore the hand. The finger doesn't make sense, the thumb placement looks weird, the palm is extremely short. There's a lot of problems with it. I think I could have done it better. I believe my sketch was already short to begin with, but I feel like I could have corrected it with the gouache because of how opaque I could probably cover things up. Outfit wise for Masaki, by the way, did I mention I was drawing Masaki? If you're new, which I feel like not too many people are, I feel like most people who watch my sketchbook videos tend to be reoccurring people, but this is my OC Masaki. So he is a florist. I usually associate him with a lot of flowers and foliage and plants and stuff, and a lot more either green tones, kind of teal tones, brown tones, and a lot of just like earthier colors. And he wears a lot of sweaters and cardigans and things that are a little bit more warm or baggy. So for today's outfit for him, I decided to go with a darker, it's a little bit thinner than his usual turtleneck, or at least I was planning to like make it look a little bit thinner until I added kind of like the ribbing of the sweater. So it kind of turned out to be a much more thicker material. And then to kind of complement the darker turtleneck, I didn't want to go darker because I knew the clovers and everything were going to get pretty dark. I went with a more kind of tan, more neutral toned cardigan, and it gives me a little bit of opportunity to figure out whether or not I wanted to add more earthier greens, that I want to push it to brown, and I kind of left it in the more grayish area, but because of my base, it kind of reads as a little bit more green, which I'm totally fine with. But something I did struggle with, like I said, I usually like my washes for these pieces a lot more than when I paint, just because I feel like it just looks and reads more delicate and soft, and I do prefer that look sometimes. And especially color wise, I tend to get color accuracy a lot more easier when I use watercolor, but gouache is very much like hit or miss for me, just because for watercolor, sometimes if you want to make a color a lot lighter, you can just dilute your color with water, but then for gouache, you could use the same principle, but you will make your paint very thin, which might make it very streaky and not very opaque. So it depends on how you like to work as well. So sometimes my color mixing is a little off, or I make some things look a little bit too jarring or a lot more darker and saturated, which tends to be the problem I have, especially working with the background. So foliage isn't exactly the easiest thing for me to draw when it's like giant clusters, or I have to go more general to specific kind of feeling. I feel like I'm okay drawing flowers if they're just like, you know, a couple of flowers here and there, and I get to add all the details, I get to focus on the flowers or the foliage on their own. But once it's in a cluster, I definitely have to think about doing the back layer first and building up to lighter layers. But you can see right here, I did a lot of dark tones on the right side and then a lot more lighter tones on the left side. So I found a reference on Pinterest of, it's not even like, I don't know if I consider it a reference per se. It was just an illustration a person did of a girl, and she kind of has like harsh sunlight on her, but there's like these really pretty, very simplified looking shapes of leaves. And the thing I liked about it was that they had a nice transition of almost this burnt orange color on the outside due to like the light passing through the leaves on the edges, and then it becomes more of a cooler yellow, and then it goes into kind of like the greens, and then it switches into nice bright blues and kind of like a darker blue to push in the green tones for its shadows. And I really like that transition. But for me, I made this overwhelmingly green, like extremely green. So later on, I'm going to attempt to add a little bit of blue here and there, but it doesn't read as exactly how what am I saying? It didn't read exactly how I wanted it to be, probably because I didn't start off with a dark blue base. I didn't go from dark blue to more of a, you know, mid-tone blue, which is going to be adding a little bit of green here and there. And then as we get lighter and lighter, I'll be adding more yellow to the mix so that we can eventually transition from blue to yellow by passing through green. So it would have been a nicer gradation. And you can see me struggling a little bit too with how I wanted to do the layering of the clovers. So Masaki is holding a 4-leaf clover. I also associate him with the 4-leaf clover, and I associate my smaller, younger OC, Koji, with the 3-leaf clover, just because he's like a kid. I feel like it just fit him a little bit better. Also with like sprouts as well. But the left side, I decided to immediately put in the lighter clovers on top, and then I was adding in the darker tones underneath them, which wasn't exactly working. I've done that digitally and it works, but obviously if you're playing around with layers, you get a little bit more leeway. But for the right side, I think was definitely a better approach. So you can see that even though the background is actually super dark, I decided to do kind of at least 2 or 3 layers of kind of clovers, and I kind of got a little bit smaller as we got forward, even though I feel like it should have been the opposite. But then once we get to the lighter colors, then, you know, I can make the shapes a little bit more defined, or I can make them just like pop out a little bit more compared to the rest, so that we kind of have that sense of depth without the struggling I had on the left side. But the left side doesn't look too bad, but I definitely like the right side a lot more. Also, I added some clovers and just like random kind of 3-ball shape everywhere else just for pattern's sake, but I did leave the upper left-hand corner blank. So I wanted to add text there, and I usually add a hello or a goodbye. So for this front page, because it is the beginning, I am going to be writing hello, but my penmanship with the brush is not that great, especially with gouache. I think I might be okay if it was maybe with watercolor and I had a steady enough hand and probably did a sketch with the pencil first, but I don't trust myself doing that, so I decided that I'm going to be using alcohol markers once again to do the text. So I'm going to pick a color that's very similar to some of the colors already present on the page. I'm going to add a drop shadow with that too. But for the leaves as well, I decided to go back in and do a very kind of almost black dark green color to kind of push the clovers in a little bit more, as well as it gives a little bit more depth to Masaki where he's laying in some areas. And then this is where I'm adding a little bit of that overlap. I'm adding a few clovers, like stray clovers and little petals here and there. Actually, for clovers, I guess they're not flowers, so it's not petals. It would be leaves, I guess. I'm not sure how to categorize it, but it's just basically like little stray pieces from the clover that I could like spread across Masaki in a way. Could've just like as if he just plopped into the clover patch or whatever, and a few got onto him. Last but not least, dust particles, because I always think it makes it look a little bit more magical and pretty. After I do that, I go ahead and use another brush to do the dry brushing. But in between of that, I actually was waiting for the paint to dry a little bit, so I fixed up his eyes to be a little bit darker. But yeah, this is the dry brushing. So dry brushing just makes it easier for me to make it look like have a glowing effect, and you use a very dry brush, usually a brush that you don't mind ruining. So also, I don't handwrite a lot anymore, so I actually forgot to handwrite the hello properly. So when I was doing the spacing for it, it was going okay until I got to the O, because I was gonna treat it like a U and it wasn't gonna work. So the O was a little bit too far compared to the rest of the, it looks like hello kind of vibe. But I decided to darken up the green with the same marker, and then I'm adding a drop shadow with kind of a cooler green grayish color, and then using the colorless blender. Because the colorless blender was very apparent, I actually liked the look of it, but it dried a little bit later, so it doesn't have this kind of warmer tone leaking off of it, which I might go back and fix so that it looks more like a drop shadow a little bit later. But this is kind of what it looks like for the final product, or the end. You can see kind of that warmer tone coming off from the drop shadow. I'm gonna put that back in because after it dried, it was no longer apparent. So yeah. And I think that's about it for the painting of Masaki done in gouache, and hopefully the backside version, which you guys will see in several months later, will be Masaki with the clovers again. I might make it more of like a night scene or a little bit darker, and then have his eyes closed. Kind of like, you know, the days have passed kind of thing, or ending of a scene or something like that. It just feels more appropriate. But then you can see that's where the sketches were. I also put a piece of cardstock in between just because some of the moisture does buckle the rest of the pages because the pages are so thin. But hopefully you guys enjoyed today's painting session, and excited to see kind of my sketching journey again in this sketchbook. And hopefully I'll be able to build up my sketchbook habit again. And I'll talk to you guys next time in the next video. Bye!